The Senate debated on whether or not to make the national holiday in honor of Mr. King or not. They started on October 3rd, 1983, and the debate lasted till about the 18th or 19th of that month. Now, Helms in the debate was an opponent of Dr. Martin Luther King Day, and he had a thick book, about 6,500 pages, I think, of FBI reports on King, and he accused him of, quote, of espousing, quote, action-oriented Marxism, end quote. This is what Helms said. Do you realize what happened to Helm? The media came down on Helm like ugly on an egg, like a bird on a worm, and this is what they said. Here's one. Edward M. Yoder, Jr., he was writing in the editorial pages of the Los Angeles Times. This is what he said, quote, but depend on Helms to contaminate a serious argument by debating points from the gutter. On the Senate floor, he resurrected the indecent carnades of the 50s and 60s, including the ridiculous charge that they were inspired by Marxist-Leninism, end quote. Earlier in the same column, Yoder said this, quote, King was a prophet, a man of good works, a thoroughly wholesome influence on American life, and the years may someday ratify the few that he should stand with Washington and Lincoln, end quote. By the way, you know, it took about 80 years after George Washington died to even have a national holiday for him. Did you know that? Didn't take that long for Dr. Martin Luther King. By the way, forgive me, I do have a religious conviction. I don't call men reverends. I don't want people to call me reverend. You'll find that term only used once in the Bible, and it refers to God, and I'll guarantee you there's nobody reverend besides God. They all put their pants on one leg at a time. And so, excuse me if I don't call him reverend. And I'll guarantee you most of the preachers today aren't reverends. A few lines later, the editorial condemnation of Senator Helms declared that, quote, his disgraceful gutter snipe tactics in the King debate set a new low even for him. Here's another one. In the syndicated column dated October 24th, 1983, Mike Royko characterized Helm as this, quote, embarrassment from North Carolina, who is nothing but a thick-headed, small-minded, ignorant, bigoted, racist bumpkin, end quote. How would you like to be called a narrow-minded, bigoted, racist bumpkin? Not me. I'm not saying anything bad about Dr. Martin Luther King. The Los Angeles Times said that Helms, quote, charged that King was a Marxist-Leninist, or at least a Marxist, on all available evidence. False and much evidence is available. The fact that the FBI watched King so closely and never found evidence suggesting that he was a communist shows rather conclusively that Helms' charge is false. Now, here's another example. You all heard about Governor Minkum? The Honorable Governor, I guess I can't say honorable, can I? Just Governor Minkum. The governor in Arizona talked about the homosexuals. Can you imagine that? He's talking about homosexuals just like the Bible does. What kind of bigot do we have over there in Arizona? But he also talked about Martin Luther King, and he didn't want to have that particular day honored. And this is what Tom Fitzpatrick of the News Times said. This is a Phoenix Weekly. And this is what Fitzpatrick said. Maycomb is, quote, a Neanderthal, a national buffoon. He is an ignorant, bigoted, opinionated jackass. If he weren't governor of Arizona, serious-faced men with white coats would be speaking soothing words into his ear and giving him tranquilizers. And it is not only Maycomb, it's the whole crew of advisors he's assembled. It's like the crew of a pirate ship that runs away with state government. They all have such bespotted backgrounds that you would expect that they'd all be wearing eye patches and wooden legs just like Long John Silver's crew. You see, what we have here in Arizona is a man tragically unsuited to the office he holds, end quote. Now, this is what can happen to you. You know, makes you begin to realize why Jesus didn't just get down on the Pharisees. he always said, "Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees." Because the Pharisees couldn't carry on their political rot and corruption without the assistance of the scribes. And it makes you wonder if we don't have scribes today. But I'm not going to say anything about the media either. I did say that once. One time I've had more than my share of experiences with the media. As you know, we've had reporters right here in this congregation taking pictures of me as I preached. Not very many churches in this county can say that they've had different channels, television channels, come in and film their services. So I've had some experiences with the media. And here a while back, I said to one reporter, I want you to know I love you. I think we are to love God's people. But I says, I don't trust you, and I think of you as just a hair lower than a prostitute. And later I reflected on what I said, and I felt bad, and I know I really need to apologize to prostitutes. How can you say that, preacher? Prostitutes. Well, let me share with you what a John Swinton once said. Now, this man was retiring, and it was at a dinner party in his honor. John Swinton was the editor of the New York Times, of the New York News. And at the annual dinner of the American Press Association in 1914, this is what John Swinton said, quote, "There is no such thing as an independent press in America. If we expect that a little country, if we accept that of little country towns. You know this, and I know it. Not a man among you dares to utter his honest opinion. Were you to utter it, you would know beforehand it would never appear in print. It is the duty of a New York journalist to lie, to reveal, or to revile. Today, it is the duty of a New York journalist to lie, to revile, to toady at the feet of mammon, and to sell his country and his race for his daily bread, or what amounts to the same thing, his salary. We are the tools and the vassals of the rich behind the scenes. We are marionettes. These men pull the strings and we dance. Our time, our talents, our lives, and our capabilities or capacities are all the property of these men. We are intellectual prostitutes." End quote. Now, this is a man that was retiring from the occupation. You notice that if you ever begin to say anything, or notice that these men, whenever they begin to even question anything about Dr. Martin Luther King, that all of a sudden the facts aren't dealt with. Senator Helms was running around with 6,500 pages from the from the FBI files. He's saying, look, and what are they saying? They're saying, you are a racist. You are a bigot. Or they say, man, this Meekum, if he wasn't a governor, he ought to be in the nut house. They're saying he's something mentally wrong. Well, how does that happen? You know, there was a former communist who's dead now, who released the teachings that he'd received from a LaPorte Church. Now, the LaPorte Church had given a lecture to American students that were attending the Lenin University in 1936. The book that I brought to the pulpit with me is one that I think we carry this, called Brainwashing, a synthesis of a Russian textbook on psychopolitics, or mind control. That's what psychopolitics is all about. And as you read this, you'll find that it was a communist tactic that in the art of capturing the minds of a nation, or to have thought control over a nation, what you had to do, if you ever had anyone oppose you, was first of all discredit them. Don't deal with the facts, he said. Just discredit them. Call them names. Do whatever you have to. How would you like to be called a thick-headed buffoon racist? Not me, boy. I'm not saying anything bad. But this is what he said also in this lecture. He said, should anyone attempt to expose psychotherapy as a psychopolitical activity, that the best defense is calling into question the sanity of the attacker. Man, he's insane, man. Can you imagine that? He had the audacity to even question Martin Luther King holiday. Get the paddy wagon, get the cookie truck, and haul him away. That's what they say. He goes on, it says, an immediate attack upon the sanity of the attacker before any possible hearing can take place is the very best defense. Did you hear it? Well, anyway, it makes you wonder, doesn't it? if maybe there's something wrong with our media today. One man said you can always tell when a reporter's lying, just look to see if his lips are moving. I don't know. One congressman said that if the passage in the Senate had been by a secret ballot, it would not have received 20 votes as far as the Martin Luther King holiday. But since it wasn't secret ballot, and it was a public ballot, who wants to be attacked by the media? And so it got passed, according to this one man. I don't know. I'm not going to say anything bad about Martin Luther King, but I do think it might be my responsibility to report to you the other side of the story. After all, Americans, don't we at least have the right to voice an opinion on the other side? Pretty good audience. Everyone's shaking their head no. Yeah, you're right. Anymore, it doesn't seem like you have the right. There are certain taboos that you never question in our society. And I say, what about those men who spilled their blood and their guts on the beaches, on the battlefields, so that America could at least have freedom of speech? So for their sake, maybe we ought to at least look and see what some other people have said about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. One lady said that he was a communist and the worst enemy that the blacks have ever had. Man, probably some idiot woman that doesn't know what she's talking about, that's just blowing off steam. She doesn't know anything, someone might say. No, that's not the case. This particular lady had worked in counterintelligence for 9 years with the FBI. She was considered within the communist apparatus in the Communist Party at the time. So she seemed to know what she's talking about, that area. Well, she probably was a racist. I guess communists, we don't have any more trouble with communists, do we? I don't hear much about communism or anything. I guess the big threat to America today are all these racists, these white supremacists. Well, you know what's happened. The white supremacists took Southeast Asia. They took China. Man, they're everywhere. 3 or 4 of them are every rock. White supremacists. That's the big danger today, we're told. Communism is something old-fashioned. They must have all disappeared. Well, this lady was not a white supremacist. She was a black lady. Her name was Mrs. Julia Brown. And Mrs. Julia Brown, as I said, worked for 9 years in counterintelligence, and she claimed that Dr. Martin Luther King was one of the worst enemies. This is what she said. Mr. King, quote, Mr. King was one of the worst enemies my people ever had. I know that it is considered poor taste to speak ill of the dead, but when someone served the enemies of our country while alive, and his name is still used by his comrades to promote anti-American activities, shouldn't people who know the truth speak out? I learned many surprising things while I served in the Communist Party for the FBI. Communist leaders told us about the demonstrations that would be started, the protest marches, the demands that would be made for massive federal intervention. Every communist was ordered to help convince American Negroes that we are no better off than slaves. Wherever we went and whatever we did, we were to promote race consciousness and resentment, because the communists knew that the technique of divide and conquer really works. We were also told to promote Martin Luther King, to unite Negroes and whites behind him, and to turn him into some kind of national hero. We were to look to King as our leader in this struggle, the communists said, because he was on our side. I know they were right, because while I was in the Communist Party, I learned that Martin Luther King attended a communist training school. I learned that several of his aides and assistants were communist, that he received funds from communists, and that he was taking directions from communists. Most Americans never look at the communist press in this country. If they did, they would learn that I left off the rest of the quotes there. But anyway, that was Julia Brown, a black woman who worked as an undercover agent for the FBI for several years. And that's what she had to say.